Some things were never meant to be known. Some secrets were buried not to protect the guilty, but to keep the world safe. And yet, here I was, tasked with erasing something so dangerous, so unspeakable, that even those who created it were terrified of its existence. Alex Carter had spent most of his life cleaning up other people's messes. Not the kind that could be scrubbed away with soap and water, but the kind that needed to disappear. Completely, permanently, without a trace. He wasn't a hitman, but his work wasn't far off from it. He had served in the military for nearly a decade before transitioning into government contract work, specializing in the discreet destruction of classified materials. If something was too sensitive to exist, too dangerous to leave behind, Alex was the man they called to wipe it from history. He never asked questions. That was the #1 rule. When a man in a black suit handed him an envelope, he took it without hesitation. When he was told to burn, delete, or shred something, he did it. He destroyed research files, hard drives, surveillance footage, and once, an entire warehouse filled with prototype tech that the government decided was too risky to develop further. He didn't need to know why. He only needed to do his job and collect his check. This time, though, something felt different. The assignment had come in the usual way. A nondescript envelope slid under his apartment door at exactly 3 a.m. It contained an address, a security code, and a single sheet of paper with the words, "Destroy all materials. No backups, no exceptions. You must complete this alone." That was already unusual. Most jobs allowed for at least one other person to assist with larger disposals, but not this one. The second red flag, the location. The address led him to Site 17 on, an underground government facility that had supposedly been decommissioned decades ago. He had heard whispers about it during his time in the military, hushed conversations between high-ranking officials about experiments that had been buried under layers of redacted documents. Nobody ever said what had been tested there. But whatever it was, it had been shut down fast and wiped from official records. Yet, here he was, being asked to destroy whatever remained. Alex arrived at Site 17 just after midnight, as instructed. The facility was located deep in the Nevada desert, far away from prying eyes. The entrance was hidden beneath an abandoned storage facility, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen human activity in years. The keypad entry code worked on the first try. That meant someone had been here recently. The moment Alex stepped inside, he knew something was off. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and metal. The long, sterile corridors were dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, casting eerie shadows along the walls. He passed by rusted lockers, broken office chairs, and stacks of old computers covered in plastic sheets. The deeper he went, the more he felt a strange sensation creeping up his spine, like he was being watched. He shook it off. Just another job. Get in, destroy the files, get out. The main records room was locked with a biometric scanner, but the system had long since deteriorated. He bypassed it with a set of tools he always carried, a habit formed after years of dealing with outdated security systems. The door clicked open, revealing rows upon rows of old file cabinets, each labeled with cryptic project names and dates that ranged back to the early 1970s. Alex set to work immediately, pulling out documents and feeding them into the industrial shredder one by one. Most of the files were expected: test results, budget reports, personnel lists. But then he came across it. A single folder, no label, no classification markings, just a thick, slightly worn folder sitting in the middle of an otherwise empty drawer. He should have ignored it. He should have tossed it into the shredder without a second thought. But something about it felt wrong. Alex hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were several black and white photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. The first showed a team of scientists in lab coats standing next to what looked like an old MRI machine, except it wasn't. There were wires, tubes, and something else, something organic, inside the machine's chamber. The next photo showed a man strapped into the machine, his face twisted in agony. His eyes were blackened, hollow. The caption beneath the image read, "Test Subject 06, Final Transmission." The third image made Alex's stomach drop. It wasn't just disturbing, it was impossible. The photo depicted an empty room, yet something about it felt wrong. The shadows in the corners were too dark, too deep. like they weren't just shadows but something else. And at the very bottom, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Do not open the door, it sees you." A sudden click echoed through the room. Alex's breath hitched. He turned sharply, scanning the dimly lit space behind him. Nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of the ventilation system. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to shove the file into the shredder and walk away. But he couldn't. His hands trembled as he flipped through the rest of the documents. They detailed something called Project 61, an experiment that had been classified above even the president's clearance level. The documents spoke of an attempt to breach the veil between dimensions, to reach into the unknown and pull something back. The final entry read, "We were wrong. It is not a gateway, it is a prison, and we have just unlocked the door." The next moment, the lights flickered violently, and the air grew thick, like the very space around him was warping. Then came the whisper. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, it was just a breath of sound, just enough for his ears to catch. "You shouldn't be here." Alex's blood turned to ice. The document slipped from his fingers as he turned toward the source of the sound. The room was empty. The hall outside was empty. But the air felt charged, electric, like something was waiting just beyond his perception. Then, slowly, ever so slightly, the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. A void of absolute darkness waited beyond it. Alex stepped back, his pulse hammering in his skull. Every instinct in his body told him to run, to burn everything, to never look back. But his eyes stayed locked on the open doorway, because there, in the blackness, something was moving, and it had seen him. Alex Carter had always been good at suppressing fear. He had been trained to push through it, to ignore the nagging voice of self-preservation and focus on the mission at hand. But as he stood there, staring at the gaping darkness beyond the open door, he realized something profound. This wasn't fear. This was primal terror. Something had seen him, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The sensible part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave the facility, torch the documents, and forget he had ever set foot in Site 17. But it was already too late. The moment he had opened that file, the moment he had read about Project 61, he had become part of something he didn't understand, and there was only one way to find out the truth. Alex grabbed the folder, stuffed it into his backpack, and bolted from the room, keeping his eyes away from the darkened hallway where the door had opened on its own. He didn't need to see what was inside. He could feel it. Within minutes, he was outside, gulping in the cool desert air as if he had been drowning. He hurried to his car, hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and he peeled away from Site 17, as watching in the rearview mirror as the facility shrank into the night. But the sensation of being watched never faded. It lingered, followed, hunted. The drive to the hidden location listed in the documents took hours. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned military complex in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. The facility itself was buried beneath the earth, its entrance a rusted metal hatch bolted shut decades ago. Alex had seen places like this before. Classified black sites erased from official records. Places where the government conducted experiments too unethical to risk exposure. This one was different. There were no records of Site 17's continuation. No declassified files, no rumors passed between intelligence agents. It was as if someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase it from history. Which meant whatever happened here wasn't just dangerous, it was forbidden. Alex cut through the lock with a bolt cutter he always kept in his trunk. With a deep breath, he wrenched the hatch open and descended into the darkness below. The air was thick, stale. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, barely illuminating the narrow corridors. Alex moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. He passed through rusted steel doors, some of them marked with strange symbols, others labeled with cryptic names like the Rift Room and Containment Vault. Every part of him screamed to turn back. Instead, he kept moving. At the end of the hallway, he found a lab. Unlike the rest of the facility, this room was intact. Computers still sat on desks, their screens coated in a thick layer of dust. Papers and files lay scattered across the floor, untouched for decades. But what caught Alex's attention was a single monitor, its power light still flickering. One file remained uncorrupted, a video labeled simply, "The Gateway." Alex hesitated, then clicked play. The screen crackled with static before revealing a group of scientists in lab coats standing in front of a machine unlike anything Alex had ever seen. It looked like a cross between an MRI scanner and an iron lung, its surface covered in wires, tubes, and incomprehensible markings. A single chair sat in the center, leather straps fastened tightly to its arms. A man was strapped into it. The timestamp in the corner read October 4th, 1983. A scientist in the video began speaking, his voice cold, clinical. "This is Experiment 12 of Project 61. Subject is prepped for Phase 2. The gateway will be opened for exactly 3.2 seconds before closure. Any entity that crosses the threshold will be contained immediately." Alex leaned closer, his pulse hammering. The scientist nodded, and a loud hum filled the room. The machine came to life, its wires glowing dark red, as if something inside was burning. The strapped man began to convulse. His eyes rolled back into his head. Then the screen glitched. For a brief moment, the image flickered, replaced by something else. A face, not human, not entirely. Its eyes were hollow, its skin stretched impossibly tight, its mouth too wide. The longer Alex stared, the more he felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like the image wasn't just on the screen, it was watching him back. Then the video resumed. The machine powered down. The man in the chair slumped forward, motionless. One of the scientists approached him cautiously. He reached out, placed a hand on the subject's shoulder. The man's head snapped up. And he smiled. Not in a way a human smiles. It was too wide, too many teeth. The scientist screamed, but it was already too late. The subject moved too fast, his hands shooting out, gripping the scientist's throat. The others in the room tried to intervene, but the man changed. His body elongated, his skin blackened, and his face, the video cut to static. Alex sat frozen. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until he exhaled, his entire body trembling. The last frame of the video had been the creature's face, staring directly into the camera. And its eyes had followed him. Alex backed away from the monitor. His mind refused to process what he had just seen. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This was something else, something inhuman. The project wasn't about exploring new dimensions. It was about bringing something back. And they had succeeded. Alex's breath hitched as a new thought struck him like ice down his spine. If this was just the experiment's recording, then where was the creature now? The realization was like a bullet to the chest. The files had been hidden not to protect the government, but to keep this horror contained. And Alex had just unearthed it. Somewhere in the facility, a door had opened on its own. Somewhere in the darkness, something had seen him, and now it was coming. The silence was absolute. Alex Carter's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he stood in the dimly lit corridor of the abandoned facility, every muscle in his body tense. The air was different now. Thick, heavy, alive. Something was here, something that had been waiting. He tried to convince himself that the fear was just in his head, that it was the weight of the horrifying video pressing down on him. But then he heard it. A sound. Soft, wet breathing. It was coming from the darkness ahead. Alex's fingers tightened around the flashlight. He lifted it, the beam trembling as it cut through the gloom. The hallway was empty. He exhaled sharply. Maybe I'm just... The sound came again. Behind him. A primal, animalistic terror surged through him. Slowly he turned. The corridor stretched behind him, the flickering emergency lights casting long, shifting shadows. At first there was nothing, just rusted doors and peeling paint. Then he saw it. At the very edge of the light, a shape. Not quite human. Watching, waiting, smiling. Alex stumbled back, barely able to keep the scream locked in his throat. The thing didn't move. It simply stood there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its hollow eyes locked onto his. Then the lights flickered, and it was closer. Alex didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. His footsteps echoed down the corridors as he sprinted blindly through the underground facility, heart hammering. The air around him grew warmer, denser, as if the building itself was closing in. He knew this wasn't possible. He had memorized the layout before coming here. The hallways should have led back to the exit hatch, but every turn he made, every door he opened, only led him deeper into the facility. It was shifting. The place was changing around him. His chest burned as he skidded into a new hallway, his mind racing for answers. This isn't real. It's not real. It's just an illusion, a trick. But the thing in the dark was real. And it was following him. The walls trembled, the overhead lights bursting one by one, the air filled with a distant, distorted laughter, low and guttural, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Alex gritted his teeth. If he was trapped here, then there had to be a reason. He needed to destroy whatever was keeping this nightmare alive. And he had an idea where to start. Alex's feet pounded against the floor as he ran toward the core chamber, the place where the experiment had been conducted, the place where the machine still remained. If there was any chance of severing this nightmare, it had to be there. The moment he burst through the lab doors, he knew he was right. The machine from the video was still there, covered in dust and decay, its wires coiling like dead veins across the floor. The chair at its center sat empty, straps still undone, but the room wasn't abandoned. The shadows moved. Alex froze. The figure from the hallway stood at the far end of the lab, but now he could see it clearly. It was tall, too tall. Its arms stretched long and unnatural, fingers ending in jagged claw-like points. Its face was a shifting mass of stretched skin, mouths forming and dissolving, eyes appearing where there should be none. It was not a man. It was all of them. All the scientists, all the victims of the experiment, their souls woven together into something that should never have existed. It grinned, a grotesque, inhuman expression. And then, it lunged. Alex barely dodged in time. He hit the ground hard, rolling beneath the machine as the creature slammed into the wall behind him. It screeched, a sound that shattered every rational thought in Alex's mind. The air around it warped, twisting reality like a heat wave. The thing was pulling him in, dragging him toward the void of its shifting form. With shaking hands, Alex grabbed his backpack, yanked out the documents. The files on Project 61. The records of everything. He didn't know if this would work, but it was the only chance he had. Alex grabbed a rusted metal canister from the lab table, a relic from the facility's past. The faded label read, "Thermite." He had planned to use it to burn the documents once he was out. Now, he'd have to do it here. The creature's limbs snapped, its body twisting unnaturally as it turned toward him. It knew what he was about to do. Alex didn't hesitate. He tore the canister open, dousing the documents in the highly flammable powder. Then, with a flick of his lighter, foom. Flames erupted, consuming the files in seconds. The creature screamed. The air shook, the walls cracked, the facility itself groaned like a dying beast. The fire spread, climbing up the machine's ancient wires, igniting whatever remnants of the experiment remained. The thing lashed out, but its form flickered, losing cohesion. Alex ran. Behind him, the lab was collapsing, the machine twisting and warping as if reality itself was rejecting it. The world turned white-hot, then nothing. Alex gasped as he woke up. He was in the same hallway again, the abandoned facility, the flickering lights, his flashlight in hand. He turned, heart pounding, expecting to see the fire, the destruction. But it was as if it had never happened. His backpack was on his shoulders. The files were still inside. The thermite was untouched. His hands shook. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. Then he heard it, a soft, wet breathing, behind him. Alex turned slowly, terror gripping his chest like a vice. And there, at the edge of the light, the figure was watching. Same tilted head, same twisted grin. The realization struck Alex like a blade through the gut. This was the experiment. He hadn't escaped. He had never escaped. The creature fed on fear. It fed on him, trapping him in this endless loop. No matter how many times he ran, no matter how many times he burned the files, he would always wake up here. The thing in the dark smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. And then, the lights flickered. The corridor stretched, and Alex Carter began to scream. Alex's scream echoed down the endless corridors, swallowed by the suffocating dark. The flickering lights buzzed overhead, the shadows stretching, warping, watching. He turned and ran. Again. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he sprinted through the maze-like facility. The hallways twisted, bending in ways that defied logic, leading him in circles. He knew what was happening. He had done this before. He had always done this before. But this time, something was different. This time, the realization settled deep into his bones. There was no way out. Not really. The thing had let him run. It had let him fight, let him burn the files, let him believe he was breaking free, but it had never let him go. Because this place wasn't just a facility anymore. It was him. The moment he had watched the video, the moment he had seen what should have never existed, it had already taken him. He stopped running. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. He turned slowly, flashlight shaking in his grip, knowing exactly what he would see. The figure, standing at the edge of the light. Tall, wrong, grinning, waiting. Alex dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam rolling away, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The figure took a step closer, and for the first time Alex did not run. The thing tilted its head. The grin widened, almost approvingly, and then the darkness swallowed him whole. The facility fell silent, and somewhere, far away, in another forgotten government bunker, a new contractor arrived for a classified cleanup job. A new file awaited them. A new video sat on the desk, waiting to be watched, waiting to be opened, waiting for the cycle to begin again. If you made it this far, congratulations. You survived, for now. But tell me, what would you have done in Alex's place? Would you have kept running? Tried to destroy the evidence, or do you think there was never a way out to begin with? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this twisted tale, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new horror story. Because who knows, the next mystery we uncover might be waiting for you. Sleep well, if you can. Subscribe now. The darkness is just getting started.